It's organized and initiated by ICAR, the ICAR Working Group on Functional Traits, and IDF, the International Dairy Federation. And both have joined an agreement on cooperation to work on animal-based welfare indicators. And originally, we thought actually today to be in the Netherlands in conjunction with ICAR to have a physical meeting there. But then we said, okay, we would like to organize this next year to meet you personally. But we decided to start work with the webinar, and we are really happy that so many have registered. We have more than 400 people who registered. So we will see how many actually will join our webinar. So the aim of the objective of our webinar is that we give a bit of a background information on the need for animal welfare assessment and indicators, but also to share knowledge on on-farm welfare assessment protocols. And as our idea is to evaluate and to assess whether there are possibilities and needs for harmonization, we also want to show you one example of harmonization which has been achieved. And after the presentations, we would like to invite you to discuss with us, with the speakers, to share your views, and that we can discuss how we can continue in the future on this topic. So we have put the program together. We have three speakers, three speeches with each one 15 minutes. The first one is about what is animal welfare, an introduction to animal welfare science and its application. It's by Marie Haskell, a professor from the Scottish Royal Agricultural College from the UK. Then we are happy to have here Elsa Vasseur from the McGill University in Canada about what animal welfare indicators exist. And Christoph Winckler, he's professor at the BOKU in Vienna, about putting on-farm welfare assessment into practice. And I have the honor to moderate this webinar together with Maria Sanchez-Mainar from IDF. I'm the chairperson of the ICAR Working Group on Functional Traits and coming from Austria. Speakers I have introduced already, just an organizational topic. When you have questions, then for the discussion, you have there at the bottom, you have these questions and answers. There is also the chat button, but please indicate your questions in questions and answers. There we will look and summarize that we have then your contributions for afterwards for the discussion. So please, Marie, the floor is yours, and please, Cesare, if you can hand over the moderator to Marie.
Thank you, Krista. I would just like to introduce my Scottish cows behind me, only virtually, unfortunately. But let me try and share my screen and get my PowerPoint up. Okay, can we see that? Can we all see that? Good, thank you. Okay, so what is animal welfare? And I'm going to talk about what it is and how it's applied in dairy cow welfare. So when we think about animal welfare in relation to dairy cows, there are a lot of issues that come to mind about things that we find problematic. So the very common ones that we think about are lameness and disease, but there's also issues with transportation, with disbudding in calves, with dystocia and poor body condition, and many others. So there are a lot of welfare issues to address. But what animal welfare science, veterinary science, and animal science has done in the past decades is develop some methods to look at welfare. So, but first we have to ask about, well, what do we want to do about welfare? We can recognize that there's problems here with pain, with stress, with fear, with other welfare negative states. But what do we want to do? Do we want to maintain things, or do we want to improve them? And maybe we also want to show what levels of welfare we have on farms so that we can ensure our consumers that the welfare of the animals behind their dairy products is good. So perhaps when we've got to good state of welfare, we want to be able to provide evidence for people outside the farm. And maybe also from a research point of view, we may want to understand more about the underlying causes of the welfare problems. Now, what's important, particularly for today, is a lot of these solutions require data. So we need to monitor welfare, and we need to collect data so that we can provide evidence about welfare improvements and also to consumers. So it's just a point I thought, which is special about today's seminar, is that data is important. So what we also need to think about is that cow welfare has many stakeholders, and they want different things from us. So obviously the cows are very interested in their own welfare, and farmers are interested in cow welfare as far as keeping them healthy, keeping them productive, and providing information to consumers. But there's also policymakers are interested in animal welfare. They are interested in maintaining national standards, perhaps having brands for certain products based on animal welfare. So it's an issue there. But also consumers are interested in cow welfare. They would like to know whether the animals that they are consuming the product of, the milk and dairy products, have they had a good life, or have they had adequate standards of welfare? And the retailers are there to talk about this as well. They are interested in providing what their consumers want, but they are more direct link to the farmers. And the other body that we're obviously interested in here today are the industry people. So the people who are breeding cows, who are organising farmers, who are the link between the national government and the farmers. And these bodies have a great interest in cow welfare because they have to deal with both the farmers on one side, consumers and retailers on others, and they're very influential. But we need to remember that each of these groups have slightly different needs from us in terms of data. So let's take a step back and see how we can define animal welfare. And here's a nice picture from David Fraser, 2008. It's a very influential kind of model. And basically, we need to say that to safeguard an animal's welfare, we must ensure that its physical and mental needs are met. So not only is it healthy and good body condition score, but its emotional state is good. And you can see that here in this model. So over on the bottom left-hand side, we have health and functioning, which is a major dimension of welfare. And by this, we mean health and nutritional status of the cow. All of that has to be good to have good welfare. Then we have the blue part at the top, which is about affective state. And this is the animal's psychological or emotional state. Is it feeling fearful? Is it feeling stress? Is it feeling even happy? A major part of its welfare. And then the idea that natural living is involved. So often consumers assume that this is where the animal is allowed to live free ranging, but actually it's more about performing its natural behavior, having enough space and resources to be able to perform the behavior that's important to it. So that's a very good model that we use when we're talking about welfare. But any introduction to animal welfare would not be complete unless we mentioned the 5 freedoms. They have been around, well, as long as I have, at least 50 years, I'm afraid to say, and they are the basis for many of the welfare assessment protocols that we have. And they are very broad, but they're a very useful starting point when we're trying to think about animals. So we're thinking about hunger. Animals need to be free from hunger and thirst. They need to have good nutrition. They need to be free from discomfort, have good housing, free from thermal stress, free from pain, injury, and disease. Speaks to itself. We need to have healthy animals. We need to allow the animal to express its normal behavior, because that's very important for its psychological state, as is freedom from fear and distress. So that's a very important framework. And the other one that we have here, the 5 domains, is very similar and developed by David Mellor in New Zealand. But what it adds to it is the idea more about mental state. So it's more of a modern take on animals, allowing them to be sentient and to consider how that might be important when we're assessing their welfare. So mental states there, we have negative ones such as pain and thermal comfort and boredom, frustration, but we also need to start to think about positive welfare. What does this mean for the animal? And what we can say about these is a very aspirational. They give us some idea what we might want to look at, but in terms of taking these things on farm, they're really not very practical. So we have to develop from these actual ways of measuring welfare. And that's what I'd like to come on to, is actually how do we go about assessing welfare problems and moving from the ideal state to actually what we can do. So let's take an example. We've got 3 examples here. The first one is lameness. And it's easy enough to identify the problem. Cows show poor locomotion and they have foot pathologies when they lift their feet that indicate that they may be in pain. And what are the important characteristics of the problem to take into account? Well, there's variation between cows. Some show high levels of lameness, some don't. And there's also variation between farms. Lameness can be more common on some farms than other. And when we look at it, it's a multifactorial problem. It's to do with the cows, it's to do with the management, it's to do with the housing and other sorts of things. So the first thing we do when we're trying to solve this welfare problem is to do some research. We look at what the causes of lameness are. We can look at what the effects of lameness on production are. And obviously it causes lack of production. And we can also look at other effects on welfare. So it causes pain, it causes changes in behavior, it contributes to other health disease states and to fertility. And then, leading on from that, we can do studies on what treatment are needed. What does foot trimming do? Can we provide vaccines and so forth? And from those sorts of research studies, we come up with some solution. We have treatment strategies around foot bathing, about foot trimming, about preventative strategies. We can look at provide housing solutions, having better flooring, perhaps using rubber matting and so forth. And another solution that's important in this regard is breeding. We can be breeding for better foot and leg health. So there we have the kind of 2 stages, the identification of the problem and research into that, and the solutions. Here's another example of a welfare problem, and this is low body condition score. Easy to identify. We have a lot of thin cows, which may not be a problem in its own right, but they seem, thin cows tend to be infertile. They tend not to get back into calf, which is not good for farming and farming systems. But also these animals also tend to have further problems, like tend to have more lameness, more disease, and show high levels of feeding motivation. And the characteristics of the problem again are that there's variation between cows. Some seem to be able to hold their condition score, and there's variation between farms, indicating that there's probably farm level and cow level factors going on. And again, the research has looked at identifying causes of lameness and looking at the effects on production and yield and other aspects of welfare. And there's been studies on how we might treat the problem, which has led to some solutions such as improving nutrition, improving the housing, perhaps making sure there's access to feed for all animals, and also looking at balancing the breeding goals between the inputs and the output for the cow. And finally, we have a different type of problem, disbudding. Now, this is a problem, obviously, where we have naturally horned cattle, but we need to remove the horns from the animals, ideally when they're young, because that causes the least amount of pain and damage. But it is a procedure that can cause pain if you don't use local anesthetic. But this is slightly different in that there's one issue here, but it's industry-wide where we're using horned cattle. And research has looked at the extent of the pain, the effects on the feeding of the calf later on, and how we can provide pain relief. And the solutions are obviously improving the use of anesthetic, but also long-acting pain relief. We might also be thinking about breeding for pollenness, but also one of the major solutions is to provide legislation that says that you must use anesthetic, or developing codes of practice that say you should use anesthetic and also long-acting pain relief. Oops. So these different resolutions reflect the level of the issue. So when we are addressing welfare problems, we need to consider the best type of method to solve the problem, and it does depend on the type of problems. So for instance, we've identified that our lameness problems are at a cow and farm level. And these are our solutions, and they're often implemented on the farm and at the cow level. Whereas the disbudding issue is actually more of an industry level problem. So we use a different solution in this way. We are actually using legislation and codes of practice to solve this welfare problem. So when we think about all of the welfare problems that we have in dairying, we need to kind of think about what level our intervention needs to be at. And now we come to the use of monitoring and data. And I borrowed this quote that you've heard many times from the business schools. And it says that if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. And that definitely goes for animal welfare. So gathering of data is important at all stages of providing welfare solutions. And often our systems come from the research end. So when you're investigating something like the pain at disbudding or the pain of lameness, you come up with you identify what you want to look at, perhaps the movement of the cow, and you create a scoring system, such as a locomotion system. That happens in the research phase. But then when you go forward to implement these solutions on farm, you're also using these scoring systems, but in a slightly different manner. So you're using these as indicators to monitor progress. So when you have, you implement a strategy like implementing foot bathing or improving flooring, you're looking again at the locomotion of your cows to see whether your intervention has worked or not. And there's a third place that we actually use these types of indicators, and that is to provide our consumers with some assurance about what we have been doing on farm and whether it's working. So again, this is a third place where our indicators come into play. We start to use them in a more structured way to assess welfare on farms. So in some ways, you could say that information drives welfare assessment and welfare improvement. And there are many scoring systems, as I've just explained, that exist for common welfare issues. And it's mainly because when we researchers and industry have been looking at that problem, they've started from scratch and they've created their own method of looking at lameness, or looking at body condition score, and looking at injuries and so forth. But really, if we want to make global progress, we would benefit from identifying some of these major issues and harmonizing our use of indicators and our use of scoring systems. And then these can be used for retailer welfare assessment tools, for a tool for farmer to monitor on a day-to-day basis how his herd is doing, for breeding organizations to use as traits in breeding programs. And there's many other ways that we could be using these welfare assessment indicators and would definitely benefit from harmonization. And of course, there's still many welfare issues to address. There's many different types of disease. We can think of injuries in cattle. We can look at the social stress and aggression that occurs when animals feed and when there's competition from resources, dystocia, and many other of these. And many of these would benefit from a cohesive approach to their measuring, monitoring, and assessment. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening, and we hope to hear your views on the question and answer and later on. Thank you.
Marie, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And I think we hand over directly to Elsa and ask her for her contribution. If you have questions, please indicate it. Elsa, the floor is yours, please.
So you see my screen?
We see your screen already.
Excellent. So good morning from Montreal, Canada. It's actually 9 o'clock here. Second part of the talk, what animal welfare indicator exists. Just a little bit of a wrap up what Murray touched, right? Standard dairy farm around the world exist everywhere. So here's an example developed by the farmers in Australia. It could be developed by the processors or the retailers. So it's the case for the wool market, for example, or we even have guidelines, for international commerce trade that developed by OE. So basically, assessing dairy welfare is a commonplace, and typically it's included in schemes that aim at overall improving dairy farming sustainability. And yes, it's industry or stakeholder-led initiatives with all the same aim, which is to earning public trust. So I like as well, the definition from Fraser, animal welfare. It's a multi-factorial approach, and I would say there's two types of animal welfare indicator. The first one are the risk factors, the other one are the outcome measure and the animal-based measure. So the risk factor is everything in the housing and in the management, so in the environment of the animal, that will impact the welfare. The focus of the talk today is really on the outcome measure, the animal-based measure, the one that we call the true measure of welfare, because you can actually measure the impact of the environment on the animal itself. So the typical outcome measure today are visual, done through visual evaluation. So here is the four main that I use in the US program put together by the dairy farmer in the US, the farm program. So lameness, injury, hygiene, body condition. So what we mean by visual evaluation, it's typically we're using some kind of numeral scoring chart. So here is the one that we use in Canada. It's on the scoring from 0 to 3, and it's a mix in that case for body or skin lesions between swelling and the appearance of what you see on the hook of the animal. So the most important part of the indicator is really to be sure that, you know, the indicator that we're using are measuring what we're intending to, and they need to be valid and repeatable. And I know Christoph will talk about that because it's key when we talk about on-farm implementation and on-farm assessments. But basically, the three aspects: we need to validate this current system, we need to ensure to have a good training program, and we need to ensure to have a high repeatability of assessments, right? Just as an example, git scoring it's the gold standard to evaluate locomotion and assess lameness on farm. The reality is it cannot be used in all systems. For example, how do you assess lameness in tie stalls? We had to be sure that the alternative method that we're using is a good method, right? So just to touch on the training aspect, you know, using a scoring chart is not it's not enough to ensure that people are actually repeatable. So here's an example of the assessment. So the estimated lameness prevalence at the farm level done between the farmer and researcher, and here in three housing system in Canada. And we see that there's discrepancies between the assessors, and this is really due to the question of training and being sure that we all assess the same. Another important aspect of indicators is actually all the question of the sampling strategy. How to be truly representative of the herd status to have reliable estimates. So how many days, how many cows, how do we account for cow level factor like milk productions, days in milk, or even the effective seeds. So the problem of the visual evaluation, it requires a lot of time, long period of data collection. When the farm is big, you stay longer, it could be multiple visits. The training and the checkup of assessor to maintain repeatability take a lot of time. Basically, it's a lot of money, and therefore usually choices are made to make it still feasible. So for example, in Canada, we have an auto-evaluation every second year done by the farmer through our certification program. Well, we need to be careful that those choices are not made in detriment of the quality of that program. So really, we need to look at those future avenues. So what's besides and what's outside of visual evaluation? Of course, the first one in mind is all the possibilities of automation. So I will give the example of application for clinical scores. For example, body condition score, it's an evaluation that's been developed, you know, for a very long time. It's been used in the field since the 80s, you know, and it's visual scoring that you do to evaluate the level of fat or body fat in the cow. Today, Elanco has developed an application based on their old charts. And the way it works is basically you take a picture and the system walks you through steps until you pick the exact score that the animal is. Really, it's following the flow chart. The reality, it's a very semi-manual way of classifying. The future tomorrow will be to be able to use other techniques to automatize the evaluation. That's only possible, you know, when we have enough huge bank of pictures to be able to do that. So the type of techniques that, for example, we are starting to work here in Canada. So activity monitor are more and more common on commercial dairies. They're used for many aspects of management, such as feeding activity, rumination, or detections. And there's current research that look at how to use them for animal welfare monitoring. There's a lot of data that are generated from those various technology that could be used for early detection of health or welfare issue at the cow level. For example, the frequency of visits at the milking system or the feeder are a good example. You know, to be able to detect animal that maybe needs to be checked. So there's a great potential to use those activity monitor to predict the welfare status at the herd level. However, the technology don't talk to each other. There's different companies, there are different software. So how do we work through harmonization? And the other important one is data are stored for limited period of time, usually stay at the farm. So the future research should really focus on the valuation of those system of those data to be able to another avenue with the question of early remote indicators. In the case of dairy, very much there's some works down on how to rely on health and performance records. So here, it's a piece that's been presented last year at ICAR by Daniel Lefebvre from Lactanet, or how do we use dairy herd improvement data to develop animal welfare index, to be able to develop and to detect without going on farm the level status of the herds. We have data as well, machine learning could be used to monitor specific indicators as well. So here, for example, it's a piece that we've, again, using DHI data to be able to detect lameness status on farm. And yes, our results show that it's possible to use this type of techniques to remotely detect their herd at risk of poor lameness status using collected farm-based data. And then, you know, it could calculate better the type of visit. So we, of course, there's other initiatives around the world using those type of data, all of those aiming at flagging herds prior to do costly on-farm visits. And all the question, of course, is the sensitivity and the specificity of those techniques. Here is some data from Sweden. And of course, to be able, the limiting factor is to be able to limit the false positive and negative. So sensitivity and specificity need to be improved. That could be, of course, linked to the quality and the type of data that we're collecting routinely on farm. But definitely there's possibility to use the data to discriminating between goods and poor welfare status, to understand the linkage with those protective practices in the management, in the genetics, and the link with longevity and herd profit. So there's a need to develop those indicators at all stages of the animal, including the rearing period, to be able to detect early problem at herd and cow level. And all the focus right now is really to try to understand the condition of use of those data, what type of data it's required, how to calculate the predictor, or again, how do they evolve. The last avenue I want to discuss with you is, of course, maybe the ability to detect the welfare status in the milk using a biomarker. A disclaimer right away, we are having many teams to have worked or continue to work on that topic, but today there's no research that led to the development of biomarker to detect cow welfare status easily, you know, in a milk sample. I will give some data from research that we're doing here in Canada, but I know that there's groups in the Netherlands and in Belgium, for example, that also looking into that. So the rationale is, we know today we have reliable behavioral indicators that will help us to detect the animal welfare research, the status of the animal. We know some metabolic indicator in the blood, like the MEFA BHP, that are good indicator of health issue, but they are not indicator of the overall welfare status of the animal. On the top of it, of course, it's invasive and it's expensive to collect this data. There's research that shows that actually what we find in a blood sample could be correlated with what we see in the milk, and therefore, you know, milk could be used for the biomarker of health. what about the welfare status? So the most recent project that we've just finished helped to develop, can we use routinely recorded data, so really milk samples collected and analyzed by a DHI milk recording system to detect herd and cows within herd with poor or high level of welfare.
Elsa, sometimes you are not very loud. Maybe to look that you are near the microphone.
Thanks, Krista.
Thank
yes.
you.
Okay. I really need to see my. Okay. So anyway, here the last slides is the type of data that came from the mostly defended thesis from Mazen Bahadi, where it was used spectral data to be able to detect the effect of housing treatment on cows. Right. So basically, what we had is we looked at 4 stool configuration with different level of welfare, and we monitor for behavioral and clinical signs, and we look at the effect in the spectral average database. Right. So basically, the milk composition. So here, what you see in the spectrum is, for example, number 6 is the zone for BHB. What we need to understand is the problem with the spectrum data, it doesn't provide an exact number, right? So we don't know the concentration of BHB, for example. But what we did find, though, is Mazen showed that basically one of the treatments was much different than the other and scored differently from milk composition. And when we try to look at exactly what's going on, we see that basically treatment tree affected minor milk components such as citric, BHB, and acetone. So basically, all those components that have been reported as indicator of elevated body fat mobilization. So these indicate that definitely maybe treatment 3 configuration should probably show that they're observing the cow's ability to access feed. It's actually corroborate the data that we find in behavior. So basically, here what I want to present is, yes, we have initiatives showing that welfare aspects could be correlated with minor change in milk composition. However, another housing system and other welfare treatment may lead to other minor change in milk component, and because they're not that specific, so there's more research done to understand that. So as a wrap up, definitely the future avenue regarding outcome measure welfare are automation, the use of DHI data and house data to remotely look at the welfare status, and yeah, hopefully one day we'll be able to measure that in a simple milk sample, but we're not there yet. Thank you for your attentions, and we'll answer questions.
Elsa, thank you very much for your interesting contribution. And I think there are already quite some questions, but I think we still wait for the next presentation, and we will discuss it then afterwards together. Christoph, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Krista. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will now, in the next 12 to 15 minutes, I will focus on more practical aspects of putting on-farm welfare assessment into practice. And we have just heard about the future avenues for automatic and remote assessment of welfare. But so far, we still, I think, have to rely on-farm assessment of the standard routine on-farm assessment of welfare. And again, you have seen this slide already, or this graph already twice. So as Marie said, it's one of the major concepts of welfare, describing welfare in 3 areas: biological functioning, mental state, and naturalness. And it just shows that the nature of animal welfare is quite multidimensional. And being multidimensional, if you want to fully grab it, it requires a comprehensive assessment protocol if we want really to cover all these different dimensions that make animal welfare. So if we look at the measures, some of them have already been mentioned, and if we ask ourselves, how can we measure all the aspects, then most people would come up with measures of physical or appearance or health measures like body condition, like skin alterations, injuries, lameness, mastitis, and so on. And we could add even more measures here to this list. However, there are other aspects, and especially if you look at the question of naturalness or natural living and of mental state, also behavioral measures play a role, and this regards, for example, agonistic behaviors. This has already been mentioned by Marie, the social behavior in a herd, but also behavior around resting, whether we provide comfortable lying areas, the human-animal relationship, or one of the measures, qualitative behavior assessment, or method to give a more qualitative assessment of the behavior, which might be used, for example, for also describing more positive welfare states. So there are plenty of measures that can be used, but if we look at the existing protocols, then the picture is quite different. And I have picked 3 protocols that are to a lower or larger extent implemented in practice. And this is, on the one hand, the Welfare Quality Protocol, which has been developed about 10 years, or which was published about 10 years ago, and which paved a bit the ground for the today's welfare assessment strategies. Then the already mentioned farm program from the US, and AssureWell, an initiative from the UK, which also came up with assessment protocols. And if you look how much is covered of these different measures, then it becomes easily clear that it's quite different. The farm program just covers 4 measures, and they are mainly cover clinical measures like body condition, skin alterations, broken tails, and lameness. And also AssureWell has a focus on clinical measures, but to some extent, to some limited extent, it also includes behavioral measures. And the only protocol that has really this more comprehensive view is the Welfare Quality Protocol. Now, what are the reasons why these different number and types of measures are included? And the comprehensiveness of these protocols depends on, from my point of view, basically on 2 main issues. The one is the purpose. So do we really want to mirror the full picture of welfare? And this is the aim of welfare quality. Or do we want to focus on the most important clinical welfare issues, the most pressing issues, where we want to achieve improvement as quickly as possible? And this is also related to the second point, consumer versus producer information. So do we focus on the information for the producer to improve the situation on the farm, or for the vet, or for advisors? Or is it a more comprehensive view, again, for the consumer who wants to be informed about the way the products have been produced? And it can also differ between whether it's for farm assurance or whether a protocol is developed for self-assessment for farmers. And there are more purposes we might come up. And the second major point is the availability of resources. This has already been mentioned by Elsa. And it's the most important aspect here is the time spent for the assessment, and time equals money, more or less. And so in many cases, for example, if it's done for farm assurance, the retailers or the industry wants to keep the time spent for the assessment quite low in order to save money. However, independent of the number of measures that are being used, or the purpose for which it is used, reliability, to get reliable data, is crucial for putting assessment into practice, or for making use out of the information that we are provided with from the assessment. And here I would like to focus on two aspects. One is the agreement within and between observers. So how well do different observers agree, but also within observers. And the other one is the sample size and sampling strategies. And I would like to start with this agreement within and between observers, especially for farm assurance, where different observers go to different farms. And it's not several observers going to one farm, but it's always one. And so they need to agree on the different measures, and they should come up with this, to a certain extent, the same result, independent who does the assessment. So different people should come up with the same outcome, and this inter-observer reliability therefore is crucial. However, also intra-observer reliability. So within the same observer should come up with the same result. For example, when he or she is watching a video or recording injuries from pictures, he or she should come up with the same result. And especially over time, it is important to avoid observer drift. And therefore there is a need to recheck reliability after a certain period of time. How can this be achieved? Training and testing is a crucial part of on-farm welfare assessment. It's usually a combination of classroom or online, but also practical training. So it's not just a theoretical introduction into the different measures, but also it's really the training on the animals and with the animals, doing the assessment in the animals. And this should then be followed by inter-observer agreement testing. And here it is crucial to have a balanced sample. So if the sample that is used for testing does not contain a reasonable number of animals with, for example, an injury or which are lame, then the observers may agree that the problem does not exist, but we don't know whether they actually can pick up the problems. And there is also a debate whether photos and videos should be used for inter-observer agreement testing or whether live observations are preferable. And of course, in research, we would always aim at doing the testing in the same situation as we would do it in the end for the assessment. However, for practical reasons, sometimes inter-observer agreement testing is also done from photos and videos, just for feasibility reasons. And retesting is recommended to avoid observer drift. Now, what can be achieved? I have done plenty of testings in the beginning with a lot of researcher groups that wanted to apply the welfare quality protocol. But recently, we also trained farmers and staff of the milk recording organizations. And in this study, for example, one of our master's students, she trained farmers and milk recording staff in a half-day training and testing. So everything was done within half a day for these different measures that are listed here: lameness, gait scoring, but also a standing score, then different injuries and different measures of cleanliness. And they are shown in the pictures below. And what is shown here is the mean percentage agreement that was achieved by these farmers and milk recording staff compared with the gold or a silver standard. So in the most cases, it was quite high, the average agreement above 80%, which would be regarded reasonable or good agreement. And only for hair loss and cleanliness of the lower hind leg, it was slightly lower, but still above 70%. However, we also have to be aware that if we look at the minimum agreement achieved among this group of 25 people, in most cases, the agreement was not satisfactory. So this points at the need of having repeated training, but also if we look for a farm assurance, that we need really a careful selection of assessors that are able to to provide reliable data. But also we can do repeated trainings, and here it has been shown in the case of lameness scoring, just deciding or assessing whether the cows are lame or not lame as a 1-0 measure. And this was a group of 4 observers that were provided with repeated trainings, and then in each session after each training, the average agreement improved. In this case, it's the kappa value, where the minimum requirement is 0.4. So already in the first session, the average, the mean kappa was acceptable, but it further improved with training, and it just shows that experience is needed to get reliable data. But also online training might be sufficient. Another master study using online training only without practical assessment, and then also testing the agreement online, and it also showed on average satisfactory, acceptable to satisfactory to moderate agreement for body condition, for cleanliness, for injuries, but also for lameness. Again, the minimum values are quite low in most cases, so again pointing at the need to carefully select people who actually do the assessments. Now, my second point is the sample size and the sampling strategy. And here in the table, I provide the sample sizes depending on different herd sizes as suggested by the welfare quality protocol. And for comparatively small herd sizes, more or less a full assessment is needed. So up to 30 cows, all the animals should be assessed. But if you look at the larger herd samples, like 100 cows or even 500 cows, then it goes down to about 50% or less than 20% of the animals. So the share of the animals that should be included in the sample to achieve a reliable assessment. However, we have to be careful. There's a caveat. Further studies have shown that for low prevalence measures, larger sample sizes are required. And in the study that is cited here, the study shows that 2 out of 3 cows for the low prevalence measures, so this could be, for example, highly severely lame animals or animals with severe swellings, 2 out of 3 cows should be assessed for accurate estimates. So this should be taken into account. But not only the sample size is an issue, but also how to sample. And basically there are 2 strategies, and one is to have the cows lined up at the feed bank and then to choose every nth animal from the animals as they stand at the feed bank. So this is a quite feasible way of achieving a representative sample. So in this case, it would be, for example, every second cow that is chosen, and that this is easy to manage. In cases where there is no headlocks available, then cows have to be sampled from the whole barn area, and then care is needed to actually select cows from all different areas of the barn, standing and lying animals, and animals at the feed bank, animals in the alleys, and from all parts of the barn, in order to achieve a representative sample in the end. So this is what I wanted to show you, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Christoph, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. We have seen now from the 3 different talks that actually data is essential for improving, and the challenge is also how to record it, and also the question of interest of different stakeholders to meet the needs, and also this how you say that, the challenge also between time and costs for recording. I would like to show one example for harmonization, because the question is also, before we go to the questions, when we start with talking with data, very often we have different standards, different types of recording schemes. And actually our motivation or to work together with IDF on behalf of ICAR on the animal welfare topic, especially on animal-based indicators, is that we want to look whether we could contribute to the whole sector of animal welfare if we could make steps forward in harmonization, as was mentioned. And I just want to show one example actually where we have achieved harmonization. So the one is this ICAR Claw Health Atlas, which was published in 2015. And it's actually an international atlas and coding system for claw health traits, where we have come up with standardized descriptions. And the way to assess was that we formed a working group together with international experts in claw health. And we finally came up with harmonized descriptions, and we were also looking for the experts were looking for meaningful pictures. And meanwhile, this atlas is translated into 20 languages. And actually, our idea is also to assess whether there is the need or also the possibility for other animal-based welfare indicators to come up to make a step forward in harmonization. To contribute also to more transparency and comparability, and also to improve the synergies when data are used for different purposes. And what we did for claw health, actually we have this working group is still ongoing, and we are still working together. So this year we have come up with an update, and also the group come up with 2 appendixes. And I think it's always a continuous process of improvement. There are also other guidelines for other topics which are also, I think, relevant for welfare. And our partner IDF has a long experience on animal welfare, and I think a very standard publication is this IDF guide to good animal welfare in dairy production, actually, which is based also on the ISO standard and OEA standards. And we are aware when we work, when we want to work in this topic, that we have different requirements from different circumstances, countries where different housing systems are. And like IDF in this guideline here shows different case studies and different best practice examples from different countries. And actually, in this way, our idea is to work together with you, also from interested expert stakeholders, and to discuss now your needs. And before we start the discussion, we have prepared a short survey, an online survey, which Cesare will launch now, and we want to ask you just to indicate this. You will receive at the screen a screenshot for the survey, and please indicate it at the end after the questions and answers, after the discussion. We will present the result. If you could just do this during, and then we will go already to questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. I am Maria Sanchez from the IDF, and I will launch the questions to the speakers. And I'm going to start with Marie. There are quite a few questions more in the practically. Let's say they want to know what type of linear traits, what type of harmonized indicators are relevant for more a continuous measurement. So for example, there's Susan who asked, good harmonized indicators have relevance in a year-round pasture-based, such as Australia? Can you give us some examples? And also maybe with that, I can also link this question that also some examples to measure the expression of natural behavior.
Maria, yes, I think that there is quite some opportunity to use indicators in pasture-based systems. I apologize that many of our examples were about house systems in the Northern Hemisphere, but things like body condition score is obviously something that can be monitored in any system as long as you have it. And lameness, colleagues in Australia and New Zealand have started to look at how you assess lameness that can come about by uneven tracks and so forth by using locomotion score. I think some of the things like the behaviours might take a bit of adaptation. So while we obviously see competition around feeding troughs in intensive systems, there may be other kind of social interactions that are more important at grass. I don't doubt that sometimes animals are competing for the best spots to graze in, but it would be interesting to find that out. And in terms of expressing natural behaviour, I think what we're trying to say there is that our animals have the opportunity to perform the behaviours they want to and need to when they want. So, at the basics, we can talk about lying behaviour. In house systems, has every animal got a place to lie down on it comfortably? If they are more cows in cubicles, that's not going to be possible. So yeah, standing and lying is something, but also, the opportunity to perform social behaviour, to interact positively with other animals, perform grooming behaviour, and so forth. So it partly depends on whether the management system and the housing offers the opportunity, but when we're trying to perhaps tell consumers that, yes, your animals have the opportunity to perform nice behaviours like grooming, then we can be using observations and perhaps indicators of these welfare traits. Hope that's answered the question somehow.
Yes, it's thank you very much. It's not an easy topic, right? Maybe I will ask now something to Elsa. I think there was quite some questions about using milk to evaluate welfare. There is someone who was asking, what about the evaluation of fatty acids in milk? And also a little bit later, someone asked, Nathalie Urrutia asked, if you could expand on the physiological link between animal welfare and BHB. Some feed supplements for dairy cows contain BHB for rumen papillae development for the transition cows, which might result in an increased milk BHB too. What could you comment on this, Elsa?
Sure. Okay, my fault. I tease you with the milk and okay. Of course, BHB has been proved to be able to detect illness, right? So I will not go on that. That's true. DHI, for example, in Canada, offer the service, right? So it could be used. The level of BHB could be used as an indicator, of health status, right? What I wanted to talk about here is, of course, a specific illness can be detected with BHB level. The question of the overall welfare status, so the animal, how the prevalence of lameness in the herd could be linked, to milk sample. It's another topic. It's a complicated one. We're getting around there. What I wanted to explain through the experiment we've done is actually it's a proof of concepts. Actually, when we do the modifications and we follow up specific cows in in a control design process, we're able to find differences in you know, some aspect of the milk composition. And I must say, I'm not sure many people have looked into that. Actually, I will not say nobody, but you know, we haven't proved a lot of that. So there's a big difference between the proof of concept I've shown and thinking that tomorrow we can just use a milk sample to be able to take the health status and the welfare status overall, right? Because it's a more comprehensive approach. I presented what we've done here. I know that in the Netherlands, for example, they're looking at the affective states of the animal, put the animal in a challenge situation or a positive situation and try to see if we have biomarkers that could relate to that. So we're working through that today. We'll see in few years where we go there. But I must say that we started, you know, from far away because nobody really was able to find that so far. As for fatty acids, that's also the next steps for us is to be able to see how it could be used, you know, to be able to detect welfare status, but we're not there yet.
Okay, thank you very much, Elsa. I will go now with Christoph. He touched a little bit on sampling, and there's a couple of questions around that. So someone is asking Dimitris, practically, what is the methodology of sampling cows? And also, are there sensor technologies that can help? So these two questions together to measure animal welfare. One about the sampling and another, what technologies can help us?
I think I already touched upon the sampling strategies. So either selecting a representative sample out of the herd, which is more challenging than if you have the animals lined up at the feed bank. So that's the easiest way to get a sample. I mean, another way would be to just draw a random sample of the cow numbers and then search for the cows. But this is often very time consuming. It's the most scientific way, but not the most feasible way. So in terms of automatic sensors, I would say that the sensors that are most prevalent right now are these activity sensors, from which we can, in many cases, already deduce lying times. So this, and there are in some countries at least, already quite can be found quite often, but they can also be used. There are rather cheap sensors to get information from a sample of animals on the activity levels, on the lying, on the resting behavior. So this is one thing. The other sensor type, I think, which is now increasingly used, are the rumen sensors, providing information about body temperature and therefore providing information on disease, on acute disease, which comes along with fever, but also on maybe on drinking behavior, which is in some cases or under some certain climatic conditions also an important information. I think these would be for the time being, the most important sensor technologies. I don't know, maybe Elsa want to add to it.
Elsa, would you have an opinion on which sensor technology would be best for you to use?
I think it's not one sensor. I think it's a combination, right? Because as I think the three talk shows that animal welfare, again, it's a comprehensive approach. In one farm, the program will be linked to maybe some aspect of feed. In some farms, it could be some aspect of stall designs. So that's where you know, it's a bit tricky to say one tool will solve all. So we know, for example, that lying time, for many years, there was a lot of hope that lying time or average lying time would be like the gold standard to evaluate the comfort of animals. So we know that actually high and low lying time are indicators of problems on farms. We have, you know, there's research that shows that yes, it could be reliable to detect, you know, identify farms with problems, but it doesn't, it's not an overall indicator of that could be used in all farms, right? So I think that's where those technology are great when they are used in combinations. The problem is to use them today in on-farm assessment is tricky because not everybody has the same technologies. It's not available on all farms, and who those data belong to. So there's challenges beyond that, but I believe that's where we're moving today with the mix of physiological, behavioral, like activity monitor, to be able, to have a greater picture, and especially working on remote assessment or early detection of welfare problem.
Yeah, that is also responding a little bit on the question bank of Chris here. How far are we advanced to combine all the data that we collect from all stakeholders along the value chain with some technologies such as blockchain? And I think you commented a little bit. Marie, do you want to add something on this?
Yes, I'm not very big on blockchain, but the idea that you could gather data on an animal from its birth right through is really attractive. So, we know that if it's a calf is born to a difficult calving, then, that affects its later life. So if you were buying a calf, maybe this is more important for beef, but where animals move from farm to farm, but being able to get that data onto a central database, maybe about its health, what it's, did it have a pneumonia as a calf, etc., would be really useful. But I think at the moment, the ownership of the data as it moves from farm to farm is a problem. But people are actually looking into this. So yeah, that might be something for the future. Okay,
thank you very much. There was a question here, Maria, I will pick on you again about cow happiness. Pauline is asking, I have a question about what could be a proper definition of cow happiness. As a dairy farm advisor, I struggle to give the farmers and stakeholders an objective definition. What is your opinion about this?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, I can see the other researchers smiling because that's a tough one. Yes. I have to say we are still researching that. So in animal welfare science, we spent many decades up until about the past 5 years defining what pain is, defining what stress is, all of the negative states. And actually knowing what happiness is just as important, but it's actually really difficult. So we can, at the moment, we can define it in the absence of pain, the absence of disease, the absence of stress. But some of the promising indicators are just to look at the face of the animal. We can see people have been using physiological measures like heart rate variability and thermal imaging to try and quantify what the face of the animal looks like when it's happy. So if you see, and you know this when you look at cows, that when you see a relaxed face, the ears are relaxed and sideways, the eyes are half closed, you're not seeing eye white, etc., then that's a reasonably good indicator that the animal is happy. The other kind of major methodology for detecting emotional state is, as Christoph was talking about in welfare quality, qualitative behavioral analysis. And in this case, again, you are looking for an animal that you judge to be relaxed, content, and so forth. And that the science behind that methodology suggests that if you are judging the animal to look relaxed and content, then there's a reasonable chance that it is that way. But I have to say, we're still in the beginning of trying to get lots of good indicators for animal happiness, even though it's really important.
Thank you very much, Marie. Christoph, I have a question for you from Nina. She's asking, which agreement should be achieved to accept results from different observers? And do you think that locomotion scoring could be used as gold standard for lameness detection?
Okay, which agreement? It depends on the measure you use. So what is the indicator that you use in terms of, it's all about agreement between different researchers, what is acceptable. So if we look at percentage agreements, or the proportion of animals that are viewed similarly by different observers, then we usually say at least 80% should be reached. 70% maybe is still acceptable, but 80% is definitely better. And so this is often taken. If you look for continuous indicators like the time needed to lie down, which can be measured as a continuous measure, then often correlations are used, and then often a correlation coefficient of 0.7 is accepted as, or is the threshold for acceptable agreement. If we again look at categorical measures, then the kappa value is often used, and this acceptable agreement starts at 0.4, but it should better be 0.6, and very good is 0.8. So we have different measures, but there are in the literature systems for defining thresholds. On the second question, the locomotion scoring as a gold standard for lameness detection, I think yes, it's still the best way to measure or to assess lameness. It may not always be the best. Well, I could not come up with a better system to actually assess lameness. Of course, you could further do clinical assessments, clinical evaluations like hoof trimming, and look at lesions in the claws, and then it's further substantiated, your assessment. But I think yes, it should still be used. But of course, then the question comes up, which locomotion scoring system should be used? And now we could start a discussion for more than 1 hour or 2 hours. So I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph. I will then direct this question to Elsa. She was talking about different types of indicators, and Gerard is asking, what are the best indicators for pain by cows? Which ones could you use?
Best indicator for what?
Of pain.
Of pain. Oh, okay. That's very specific. Well, there's a bunch of indicators that's been used and that continue to be used. You know, if we think about on-farm evaluation, I will say that behavioral indicator is a good one. Vocalization is a good one. There's a lot of papers, especially using disputing or dehorning, you know, as an example that shows indicator of pain. So I will say for farmer, definitely that would be the one to go. Of course, there's a bunch of physiological indicator that have been used to evaluate pain, chronic or short term. But their applicability on farm, I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know who can answer this question, maybe Elsa or Christoph. There's a question of Elena. She's asking, is there a recommendation on how to weigh the different groups from Fraser? Health, functioning, affected state, natural living? For instance, living in group versus injuries due to agnostic behavior.
I will let Christoph start that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no scientific way for this weighing. So in the end, what we can, as scientists, what we can provide is the basic parameters, and we can look for valid indicators so that we can come up with indicators that tell us something about the mental state, where we are sure that it's actually measuring what it is intended to measure. So is it a good measure of pain? This can be proven scientifically. Is it a good measure of a certain mental state, of an emotional state? That's already quite tricky, but this could be achieved, at least could in future be achieved by scientists or by research. How the different dimensions like mental state and naturalness and the health-related information should be weighed is in the end up to society, from my point of view, or by stakeholders. because they all have different views. So it's a value-laden concept in the end, where depending on the stakeholder groups, different weights are given to the different dimensions. And so this can only be done with a broad discussion with stakeholders, including whoever you want to include. But the most important point is that you are transparent about what you have been doing and whom you have included in this process. So in the end, it's not a scientific discussion anymore. It's a societal decision on where we put more focus on. And maybe I can also comment on a comment a bit above by Marco Horn, how good is good enough? That goes into the same direction. So what is the best way to define thresholds when looking, for example, at clinical signs, such as lameness or lesions? Again, this is not about weighing the different indicators, but again, what is acceptable is not a scientific discussion anymore, or a scientific decision anymore. It is a societal one. And so it can only be done with a broad stakeholder discussion and involvement, from my point of view. And for example, this is now being done by the KTBL in Germany, where they look at such thresholds, alarm thresholds and acceptability thresholds for different welfare measures.
Thank you very much. And I think I have a question for Marie, a practical one. There is Hossain from Bangladesh, and he would like some advice to start a design on research on animal welfare in dairy farm. So what could be the first advice that you could give him if he wants to start working with this?
I think sometimes the best way is actually to start with the stakeholders. What do people think are the main problems that you see in dairy farms and dairy cows in your region? And then move from there to try and look for indicators for them. So perhaps, you know, if it's udder health, then you maybe can look at the literature and see what has been done on looking at, you know, levels of pain, levels of swelling, maybe clots in the milk or so forth. So I think that the first place to start is to identify the goals, what traits you need to measure, what are the most important for your animals in your area, and then start to look at trying to find some scoring systems for them. And once you've done that, then try to take it out on farm to look at how you can actually get these measured in practical terms. But another thing to say is kind of in the background, there has to be some kind of recording system. So if there are databases to be able to record all this information on, then you're able to provide people with feedback. And benchmarking is an important aspect of welfare assessment, really. So you can tell each farmer, well, you know, you're doing really well compared to everybody else, or you're not as good. And, you know, in the background, here are some recommendations about what the people who are doing the best do. So yeah, that's a short answer, but those would be my recommendations. Maybe Christoph had more to say on that kind of procedure.
No, I agree.
Oh, good. That's good.
Very good. I have one question here about lameness, and maybe it's for Krista, or feel free to any of you who answer. But because we have this atlas as well, and they say, in case of lameness and BCS, should we move on towards full automation, or is there still room for improving assessors' training protocol? What could be your advice?
Who wants to talk? I think Christoph has already answered it. That for the time now, the sensor systems are increasing a lot, but so far, I think there is still, from our experience, there is still quite a lot of research needed. And we think that there is still need for lameness scoring and these types of assessment at the moment. But it's important to look and to make sure that these new possibilities can be used, because all the other things are quite a lot of work, and also for early detection, it's important to have real-time information, or almost real-time information available.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question from Pauline, which is quite comprehensive. I think it's a problem that we all face. What about the interaction between what we can assess in the dairy industry as farmers, dairy advisors, the private assessment models developed by several companies, for example, cow signals, and what you do as scientists? Do you see a way where we could more actively and proficiently communicate and work together to improve welfare? Maybe Marie, you have some suggestions?
Yeah, that is a really good point. I think possibly, again, it starts with a lot of the problems have been because they're historical, I suppose, that, you know, when people have been looking at body condition score, every group who was looking at body condition score in the past came up with their own model and their own scoring system. And it's very hard to then ask everybody to give up and move to a centralized one. However, I mean, I think what we are thinking at the moment is harmonization can solve that problem. It can kind of, you know, match across scoring systems. But I think that it's all about willingness as well to be involved, and allowing a level of communication to grow and a level of trust to grow. I think we have a lot of problems, particularly in the UK, where, you know, retailers have specific farmers that supply them, and they have their own welfare system. You cannot see that system because it's different from the other supermarkets. So it really makes life difficult. And I think actually, you know, this is what we are asking, is that harmonization will, everybody kind of talking the same language, as it were, would help a lot. So yeah, that is why, to some extent, why we are interested in this project, is I think that can help.
Thank you very much. There was a question before about beef cattle systems, and they were asking if there were similar indicators for beef cattle systems. I don't know if maybe Elsa wants to reply to this question.
Yeah. There's assessment for, I will say, probably each species that is farmed today, okay, from beef to sheep to fish. So yes, there's assessment for each of those that exists. If I want to complement on Marie's, you know, the whole objective of working us on the working group at ICAR is to encourage DHI to take those measures, because the day that DHI is taking measure, you know, in each country, then, you know, we don't need to rely on individual schemes, right? We can have data that are actually collected, you know, universally. So that's why it's important that, you know, ICAR is coming with recommendation, and ideally, milking recording system in each country is at.
Thank you very much. And I will just have a last question, is about assessing seasonal production systems, and what period in the production cycle would you advise to carry out the welfare assessment on farm on seasonal production systems? Maybe Christoph, do you have an answer for this?
Again, I think it depends a bit on what your focus is at. So I would guess, if we talk about seasonal dairy production systems, I would go for the most critical period, which is the first, let's say, the first 100 days of after giving birth. So this would be probably towards the end of these first 100 days, and then you would have most of the cows in this period, in this lactational stage, and this would be my suggestion. So that's a very much problem-oriented approach. You could, of course, also say, I'm also interested in later stages, and showing that after 150 or 200 days, the cows are perfectly happy on pasture still. if we are talking, for example, about a pasture-based system. So again, it depends a bit on the purpose, but primarily I would suggest to go for the first 100 days.
Okay. Thank you everyone for the contributions and questions, and also the speakers for answering. I think we have a few questions open. We will take care after it. Cesare will save the questions so that we will have it. And now we would like to share the result on the polls with you. Cesare, please could you
so I'm going to close.
Allow this?
Yes, I'm going to close the
and
polling.
then all of you need on your screen, you have here polls, or in your language as it is. I have it in German. And then you can click there, and then you can see the summary.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to close.
The summary, Cesare, is it?
Okay.
Because at the moment I don't see it. Ah, yes, here I can see it, and I think you, if you click there, you can also see it. So we see who has participated today, or who has actually. We had about 290 participants, and 198, I think, have participated in this online survey, and we see that 34% of our participants were veterinarians, 11% farmers, 19% people from DHI organizations or breeding organizations, 3% from certification body, 16% from advisory bodies, and some 25% from other groups. And we asked the question, is harmonization of animal-based welfare indicators important? So an overwhelming majority, actually, of 97% said yes. So actually, I think we know that we should continue to work on this. Then we also asked, because we need to know where to start, and actually which animal-based welfare indicators to have the highest priority for harmonization. We had to summarize it a bit, because in this online survey we could only ask or make 10 topics to choose. And so we asked you to indicate the 3 most important ones. So we see actually lameness has 69%. The next one is diseases, mastitis, metabolic disorders. Then there is injury, then is body condition score, lesions. And actually, I didn't present this, but actually on lameness, we have already published a guideline. So I think we will have to promote or to indicate it that it's there, but you're welcome also then to contribute whether this is useful also for welfare assessment. And for diseases, there is actually already some work done also on health keys and reproductive disorders. There is also a bit done already, but we need to continue in this work. And here we have one question: how useful you think are sensor data for describing animal welfare in the future? So about 50% of the opinion that they are very useful, and the others thought they are useful. So we see there is high expectation, and I think it's important also that research and this will continue. And coming actually to the end, the seminar will be available online. We will send you a survey, and if you are interested in cooperation, please indicate. We are planning a physical meeting, a workshop, which should have been today in the Netherlands. So the plan is for next year in April, again in the Netherlands, in conjunction with the ICAR meeting. We hope it can then take place, and we would be really happy if there you would join us. And also for work we are doing before, if you would contribute, and we are interested to share your views and your approach. And I want to thank all of you on the participants for the participation, but especially the speakers for the preparation and contribution. Also my colleagues from the ICAR working group and the colleagues from IDF for preparing, and especially for Cesare, special thanks to Cesare. He had a lot of work with organizing all this, and in this way, thank you and all the best, and we are looking forward. Yeah.
May I interrupt you? And
sure.
may I suggest to allow someone who raised the hand just for testing the system that everything is working, like Mike or someone, or Alessia or someone else, just to present the question live. Maybe is it too late, or?
Actually, we are already at the end.
Okay. Okay.
I think it would be good if you can, in the survey, there will be also then a field to indicate comments, questions. We will take care of that, and also the questions and the chat will be saved. And so we will come back. I think as we are a few minutes over time, I think we will finish, I don't think, for testing the system.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and all the best.
You will get the link by tomorrow.
Thank you, Cesare. Thank you, and thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.